Welcome to the Weights and Plates podcast. I am Robert Santana. I am your host, along with Trent Jones, my co-host.
Howdy.
Howdy, partner. And today we have a special guest. Would you like to do the intro, Trent? You're like way better at this than I am.
Sure. So, today on the show, we welcome Andy Baker. Andy is, I think, in all respects, a master coach. He is the co-author of two of the foundational books for the Starting Strength Method, Practical Programming, 3rd edition. We call it the Gray Book for short. He's also the co-author of the Barbell Prescription, which is a great book on training for the over 40 crowd. And on top of that, gosh, Andy's got tons of articles that he's released on his website. And now, or I guess as of about a year ago, he's also got a podcast, the Baker Barbell Podcast, where he shares his thoughts on all sorts of training and nutrition topics. So welcome to the podcast, Andy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think today, we wanted to have you on because, one of the things that I appreciate about your content and the stuff that you put out is that you have a really wide range of interests within training. So you are a starting strength coach. You've obviously written a lot of material for starting strength, and that's primarily about lifting to get strong and lifting for novices. But you also have written a lot of things, and you've released a podcast about training beyond the novice phase, as an intermediate, training for powerlifting, training for physique, and building mass as well. So you've got a pretty wide base of interest, and we wanted to tap into that today.
Yeah, I mean, that's just me being kind of following my interests and my passions. I mean, every business book in the world would tell you, niche it down, specialize in just one thing. But honestly, my interests span a lot of things. I like to experiment. I like working with a lot of different people. I mean, we were kind of talking before the show, the amount of hours that you put in coaching on a daily basis, both in-person coaching at my gym and the online coaching and stuff that I do. I feel like if I was working with one demographic on one thing all the time, it could get kind of repetitive. So I enjoy working with, novices looking to, to build strength and looking to learn the basic barbell lifts. I love doing that. I'd incorporate that, basically with all my clients of all demographics. But then beyond that, I like working with people who want to go compete in powerlifting. I like working with people who want to build a physique. I've always had an interest in bodybuilding, since day one when I got my start. I've always had an interest in that. I like working with athletes. I work with some high school and college athletes. I find a lot of interest there as well. I like working with older people in special populations. And, so it's just, and I find that the more, the more people that you work with, the more you learn and the more engaged you can be, and it to me, it's a way to prevent boredom and burnout, if nothing else. But I find all of those things, highly fascinating. And so it makes for an interesting day at work for me.
Yeah, no, I would have to agree with that. I've had a similar trajectory myself, and it kind of ties into why we wanted to bring you on here. I just came off another podcast a couple days ago about a similar topic. I was on the RP podcast that comes out next week. We did a 3-way with Dr. Mike Israetel and Nick Shaw, and we were just talking about this idea that there is a dichotomy between strength and quote-unquote hypertrophy, right? And the kind of theme of the podcast, and I wrote several articles about this and talked about it on this podcast, is that, one way or another, when you deconstruct any type of lifting program, you're always getting stronger, And
sure.
The problem that we've run into recently, I think this is a more recent development. I mean, it's always kind of been there in a lot of the mainstream publications that have come out over the last 50 years, but it's been more of a modern phenomenon where you get guys just bragging about how much work they did. I did this many sets. I did this much volume. I did this much tonnage. And this is given birth to this concept that load doesn't matter, that load doesn't matter. And we've seen it in when you look at the one area where there's overlap, and I probably say this in every other episode, between the quote unquote scientific research that's, not that much more scientific than what we do when you really get down to look at it. But between the professional research people and gym owners and coaches alike, is that eventually it all has to get heavier. I brought this up the other day, and Mike was like, well, we just did, he did some research study with Schoenfeld where they looked at adding reps versus adding load, and I think it's the first of its kind. And he said there wasn't really much of a difference. Stop, but eventually they had to add load. So that was like the whole point. That's kind of how he finished his sentence. He's like, yeah, there's not much of a difference because novice effect, we've all talked about it, it's in the books, etc. You start riding a bike, you're going to grow muscle, my girlfriend did marathons and her calves grew. So, if you haven't lifted before, you're going to build, but we kept ending up in the same place. Yes, you could add a set next week, you can add a rep next week, but then eventually the load has to get heavier. And that's really kind of the theme of, what we wanted to talk about today and what I've been kind of hammering on with this show, because I think that's what tends to be missing. We get a lot of guys that are not so jacked, but they're not super obese either. They're just, normal looking in clothes and just complain that, I'm soft, I'm fat, whatever. And the limiting factor there is usually strength. So that's, that's something I brought up the other day. What kind of drew me in this direction, that was my baseline. I had muscular legs. I started cycling very young. I rollerbladed. I did a lot with my lower body. So I had no problem with lower body, but I just had trouble developing up top. And after years of, following silly shit that I found on the internet, it dawned on me that a lot of the guys that I was looking at that were jacked were not limited by strength. Their baselines were very high. Like my brother's one of them. He was probably benching 225 his first year lifting when he was like a teenager, whereas, I had to spend a whole semester in swimming to get to 95, So it became clear to me, I'm like, my limitation is strength, but these guys that are doing all this bodybuilding stuff, oftentimes they are not limited by strength, at least not for very long. So, I'll let you kind of piggyback off that and throw some of your ideas out there. We'll just go where the wind takes us.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you because I've thought about it quite a bit. What is the main difference between, say, and when I talk about bodybuilding training, most of the time it's kind of, to me, it's lowercase b. Because most of the people that we work with are not actually, it's such a small sliver of the population that's actually interested in, say, competitive bodybuilding, which is really a diet competition as much as it is a training competition. It's a matter of leanness. But anyway, that's beside the point. But what is the difference between, say, bodybuilding versus, say, powerlifting or just, strength training in general, basic barbell type of training? It's really... The difference is it's mainly on the training. There's some philosophical differences and that sort of thing. But when you break it down, like what's the main differences on the training floor, like on the gym floor, it's really an exercise selection. That's really the main thing. It's specificity, just like any other sport. And when you start talking about, say, think about Olympic lifting. I mean, how do we start out with an Olympic lifter? I mean, we build them a base of strength first, right? We would posit that the best way to, build up the clean and jerk and the snatch in the short term for somebody who's never lifted before is to get strong in a general sense, with maybe some small focus on the clean and jerk and the snatch at the beginning. And as that lifter builds more muscle, builds more strength, and gets to a certain point, it's going to shift more to where a much, much higher percentage of their training is going to be directly working the clean and jerk and the snatch, all those variants, still keeping the base of strength in there. And the same thing can be applied to bodybuilding. If you've never lifted before, you're really a true rank novice. I mean, the right course of action in general is not to start on a, really advanced, broken down body part split type of thing and doing a lot of specificity on each muscle group. It is to build a better general base of strength. And then the longer that you go, the stronger that you get, the less just getting stronger on say squat, bench, deadlift, or whatever the more you're going to have to specialize and focus on that individual sport, or that, if it's not a sport, just we'll say an endeavor, the more you're going to have to specialize on that endeavor. And what happens is for, someone that's becoming more of an intermediate to advanced trainee, is that the exercise selection is going to change. In my opinion, you're only going to get most people. Now there's obviously there's exceptions to this. If you look around in powerlifting, there's a lot of guys that, I'd say 90% of their training is basically squat, bench, deadlift on repeat. They do real high frequency. They do a lot of volume. They don't do a lot of, high relative intensity sets. So a lot of their sets are stopped, at what we'd say a low RPE, well short of failure, and they grow like weeds. And their physique reflects, it looks more, kind of that body, it takes on that bodybuilder-esque type physique.
Yeah.
I would say that's not most people though. Most people, there's a whole lot more lifters that you'll see that follow that approach, and even guys that get very strong doing that, but you more or less don't necessarily look like they lift. And part of that is the exercise selection, and depending on your build, how you squat, bench, and deadlift, those exercises may or may not be the best at delivering, at building up the physique. And so you're going to alter the mechanics of those movements or even do completely different movements, over time. But at the beginning, those movements and other basic, kind of barbell movements are really, really good starting place to kind of build that base of strength that then makes it even easier to transition onto other stuff.
So one of the things that I run into talking with clients about this exact concept is that they often don't really have an idea of like what base of strength means. So like I find like for the most part, the people that I work with, which granted are usually finding me through starting strength, so they're already kind of predisposed to understand like, hey, we're going to lift the barbell and we're going to focus on a few basic exercises and get strong on those first. But they'll usually buy into the barbell part of it. But where I sometimes find there's like a deviation between like what they think base of strength means versus what I have in my head. So Andy, do you have like certain like break points where like you want to see a guy in general squatting about X or benching about X before, they're really able to benefit from more, quote unquote hypertrophy exercises?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think as a community we have a really good answer for that, because you're looking at, there's a lot of factors in there. It's like, okay, well, if the one thing I always tell guys that are interested in bodybuilding, unlike powerlifting, when you're powerlifting, one of the nice things about that is the criteria for exercises are done for you. Like you have to squat, bench, and deadlift, right? Or at least, some guys do a lot of frequency on that. Some guys do less, but at some point in your training, you're going to have to squat, bench, and deadlift. You have to learn the technique. You have to get the, those neurological pathways kind of established. In bodybuilding, there's no single lift that you have to do. And I think it's a good idea that you do a lot of the basic barbell lifts, but you don't necessarily have to do anything. So for a guy whose ultimate aim is to get into bodybuilding, what is a good base of strength? I'd say, squat, bench, and deadlift, and let's, overhead press, or, there's a handful of other movements outside of the competitive power lifts would be good proxies for that. And then you get into, okay, it's not just exercise selection. What about rep range? For a guy that's interested in bodybuilding, do we need to focus on what his 1 rep max is? Sure. I would argue that for a more advanced bodybuilder, that's almost irrelevant, because there's things about a 1 rep max that are more skill-based, neurologically based, that don't have, it's not a good use of time for a more advanced bodybuilder to do a lot of 1 RM type of work. Now they may do it on occasion. I mean, a lot of guys do. They like say, how much do I bench? It's not like it's the end of the world. It's not like you can never pull a max effort deadlift or do a max bench or whatever. Most guys, even bodybuilder guys, are going to do it from time to time just because we all like being strong.
Ronnie Coleman.
But right. it's not a good use of your training time to do from a programming standpoint, to do things that are really far on that end of the spectrum in terms of the 3 reps and below type of stuff. That type of work is going to be best suited for people that are interested in whose primary goal is lifting the most weight on a given lift. The same thing, it wouldn't make any sense to do, super high repetition, 20 rep. Now, does a 20 rep leg press or a 20 rep squat have its place sometimes in a bodybuilding program? Sure. But are you going to build a program around 20 rep everything? No. I mean, I think most people, and I don't think there's a whole lot of debate about this. I mean, most of us recognize that for muscle building standpoint, if you had to pin down a rep range, now again, this varies on what exercise you're doing or even what body part you're doing, but most of us would say that it's probably somewhere like the broad range would be like 4 to 12. Like that's kind of your your mid-range for kind of muscle building purposes. On some of the barbell stuff, you could say, well, it's more like, maybe 4 to 6, 4 to 8 is a good range, that 5 rep range, maybe more isolation stuff or things like biceps or whatever. It's going to be a little bit on the higher end, more the 8 to 12 range. But in general, most of the work that you're going to be doing is going to be in that, let's say 4 to 12 rep range is going to be the sweet spot for most exercises and most muscle groups if your primary interest is in hypertrophy. So the progressive overload part applies for sure. Like the main objective to me is always to get stronger. It's just going to be more in kind of that medium rep range building up your best set of 5. Like that actually turns out that's actually a pretty good proxy for, it's hard to measure muscle growth. It's hard to measure muscle growth on a daily, weekly, in a short term. So the best proxy that we have to measure the effectiveness of the training stimulus, or whether if you're getting stronger, you're not losing muscle. That's for sure. Yeah. Especially if you're getting stronger in like that medium rep range. 1RM strength is kind of, that can be hit or miss. I mean, you guys that have, especially like on heavy deadlifts and stuff like that, like if your nervous system is not in a place where, you're not going to perform well on that really heavy shit. So I'd say that for muscle mass, your best lifts, your best 5RM, your best 8RM, that kind of stuff is going to be a better predictor of whether or not the stimulus that you're doing is effective for muscle growth.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
That makes sense. Well, yeah, that's really good foundation for the topic here. So, totally makes sense. We don't need to be wasting our time with really low rep sets if the goal is building muscle mass. What I wonder as an analog to that is, before, and we're going to get into like what kind of movements that you like for building muscle mass besides the basic barbell lifts. But let's say for somebody who's a novice or maybe an early intermediate lifter, where do you want to see, let's say, their bench at for 3 sets of 5 or for a 5RM before they really start getting deep into like doing chest accessory work like flies or whatever? Do you have do they need to be repping 225 or does it matter?
225 would be a fair number. I mean, that's if you're going to compete in bodybuilding, let's say, for instance, or just be, I mean, if you go into like everybody loves to beat up on the gym bros, right? Like it's kind of a fun stereotype. But if you go into Gold's Gym and looked at like the jacked guys in the gym, I don't mean like the most jacked guys, but just a guy you go, that guy's pretty jacked. Like they all can rep 225 on the bench.
Yes,
like that's
right.
You know what I mean? And lazily, so it's not, how many bodybuilders with a good pair of quads and hams can't squat 315 for reps. 405 for reps is probably even more. I mean, there's a good bodybuilder I follow. I mean, he's like 160 something pounds and he's not a strength athlete, but he is. I mean, 405 for reps is pretty, I'd say that's,
it's pretty good.
It's hard. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it does have to do with build and that sort of thing. And the way you execute the movement matters and all that sort of thing. But, it is hard to put a number on it, but I'd say, for squatting, I mean, 315 for reps for sure.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think that's a pretty low bar, for a guy that we're assuming this guy is maybe early 20s or something like that. That's a pretty low bar that you can get to somebody on a basic novice type of program, without killing them, without having to do a lot of really low rep work. Like most of us can take a genetically, average to above average guy with the right amount of motivation that will adhere even 80% to his diet and shows up for his sessions. Most of us can take a guy like that and get him to a 3-plate squat for 5s fairly easily, I'd say. And then after that, then I would say, I've been taking novices through the starting strength progression for a long, long time. And, we don't define novice, intermediate, advanced necessarily by how much weight they lift, but it's a pretty rare bird on a daily type of linear progression that's going to get to, say, 405. I mean, we have some, but it's, I'd say most of the time, most guys peter out somewhere in the low 3s. I don't know if that squares with what y'all, and then before you have to start tinkering with the programming a little bit, and so I'd say that people have kind of a natural endpoint, to where but I'd say that's low threes for a younger guy, bench, low twos, something like that.
Yeah.
Deadlift. I mean, a guy that's doing 315 for reps is usually going to be able to deadlift, or a guy that's squatting 315 for reps is usually going to be able to deadlift 405 for reps, probably, unless he's got some fucked up build or something like that. But that's that's kind of a 225, 315, 405. If you want to just use even plate math for it, that's fair.
Yeah, as long as you're in the ballpark, right?
Yeah.
Of those numbers. Yeah, I wanted to just point that out because I know some people are gonna hear this show and think like, oh yeah, man, I'm all in. Let's throw in the curls, let's throw in the flies and the cable rows, and it's like if you're squatting 225, then maybe you should work on that first before you move on to this.
Yeah, I think because all that's there's going to be an interference effect from a lot of that stuff, and so while it might. In theory, it's not necessarily bad to do leg extensions, leg curls, hack squats, all that kind of stuff. You can only do and recover from so much in a given training week. And, if you can just plow through and get some of those basic strength numbers up, it's going to just like with the Olympic lifting analogy. I mean, if you can get that baseline of strength up, I mean, how much better is your clean and jerk and snatch practice going to be? When you're working with those heavier weights, you're going to have more body control, you're going to have more muscle mass. It's just going to be better overall. It applies to everything. It applies to CrossFit. I mean, if we're going to work with a CrossFitter, do we want to start them on a full-on like CrossFit program on day one if they've never really lifted? Or would we say, I mean, who are the guys that really do well in like the CrossFit games? Well, most of them come in pretty strong, right? I mean, they come in with a good base of strength, and then you teach them. I mean, I don't do this. I kind of know how it works, but you're going to learn all the skills of CrossFitting, the gymnastic stuff and the conditioning stuff or whatever. But it's always going to work better in the CrossFit world if a guy comes in with a really, really good base of strength, with those numbers, versus if a guy's coming in and he's benching 95 pounds and squatting 135 and deadlifting 185. I mean, how much WOD stuff do you need to be doing? Or would you be better to build that muscle and build that strength, and then it's not necessarily that you stop. It's not like you could put a hard stop on the strength stuff, but you start to incorporate that stuff a little bit later.
So let's talk about that guy, because I know he's listening, and what he's gonna take away from what you just said is, well, I don't have to lift heavy because I'm just training for looks. I just want to look better. And meanwhile, he's squatting 135. I run into this all the time. They'll say, I don't care about performance. I care about looks, but looks are a function of performance, right? So when you say an advanced bodybuilder doesn't need to do a 1RM or train triples or anything like that, describe that guy and how that is different from our pretty much novice, possibly early intermediate that's just been jerking off in the gym and just decided to call us.
Well, I mean, it's it's performance based whether you want it to or not. I mean, that some things you're going to have to improve. I mean, so you're at a 135 for 5 squat. Okay, where do you go from there? So there has to be some form of progressive overload. So we say, okay, well, we don't need to add any weight to that 135 squat. So what do? We add a rep. Okay, next week's 135 for 6. In theory, okay, that's okay with me. And then where are you going to go with that? You're going to go to 8, you're going to go to 10, and then what? You're going to go to sets of 20, you're going to go to 3, and you're just going to stay with 135 forever and keep adding, days of the week, keep adding frequency, keep adding volume, keep adding reps. I mean, it's just, in a way, it's just from a practicality standpoint, never mind the fact that it really doesn't work to do it that way. It just doesn't, but it just becomes more of an efficiency thing to add the load, and so, does it really matter what your 1 rep max is if you want to be a bodybuilder? No, but also, even if you never test a 1 rep max, if all you do is squats in the 5 to 8 range and you progressively overload squats in the 5 to 8 range, guess what's going to happen to your 1RM? It's going to go up, whether you test it or not. You know what I mean? I mean, it may not be world class if you never train 1RMs because you may lack the skill or whatever. But if you take a guy's squat from 135 for 5 to 225 for 5, guess what happened to his 1RM? It went up.
Yeah,
whether you tested it or not, it went up. So my contention is not that you don't need to get stronger; it's that you just don't need to spend a lot of time training in like that 1, 2, and 3 rep range necessarily if physique is the goal or if muscle mass is the goal. But it's not, but the load still has to go up. I mean, my biggest influence in the bodybuilding world is, and a lot of guys don't know who this is that's listening to this, is a guy named Dante Trudell.
Oh yeah, he came up with the cycling for pennies.
Yeah. I mean, and you don't necessarily have to agree with everything, because you have to look at the context of who Dante worked with, and that drugs massively influenced the dog crap method and all that kind of stuff. But if you break down, I mean, and I've heard him say this, if you break it down, it's find exercises that fit your structure that can be progressively loaded over time, which doesn't apply to all exercises. Find exercises that can progressively load over time and get as strong as humanly possible in a medium rep range. And that's basically it. That's that whole, I mean, that's that. If he, and I've heard him say that, so I'm not extrapolating. It's more or less a direct quote that's bodybuilding training in a nutshell. And this is the guy who's mostly credited for, and his influence is still very, very, he doesn't coach people, he owns a supplement company, but his influence is all over bodybuilding. And the best bodybuilding coaches in the world, the Matt Jansons of the world and that sort of thing, are all influenced heavily by Dante. And that's basically his whole thing was, and that was his deal in the 90s, was coming in and saying, so many of these guys are just, they're fluff training. They're doing, it's kind of like today's thing.
Same thing, yeah.
They're doing 1 million exercises. They're doing, 20 sets of biceps and 20 sets of triceps. Everything's in the 15 to 20 rep range, because everyone was so in love with the idea that the pump, you just get that pump and you just keep going and you keep getting the pump. And then when the pump dies, that's the end of your workout. And, if you're an experienced trainee, I mean, I can take a pair of bands and get a massive pump in my triceps or my bicep, but how much growth am I going to get from that? So that was kind of his thing was, look, you need to strip away all this volume. You need to strip away doing 20 different exercises for every body part. You need to get down to the 5 to 8 range, or the 6 to 12 range, or whatever it is. And you need to get progressively stronger on lifts that allow you to get progressively stronger. And that's the thing is, how far can you take a dumbbell side delt raise? And I actually think that's not a bad exercise, but how far can you progress that? I mean, you see guys in the gym doing strict sets of dumbbell side delt raises with 100s. No, you don't see that. No. There's an upper limit on that. But is there an upper limit in theory, is there an upper limit on how strong you can get on a barbell overhead press or a dumbbell overhead press? I mean, all of those movements can be loaded infinitely. And those are the movements that we want to focus on. And the barbell movements are probably better than any movements can be loaded, in theory, infinitely, And so that's where we put our focus. So you take those movements that can be loaded, and then you load them in that medium rep range, and then you eat.
Man, I remember
that's how you get big.
I remember that thread back in 2003. I tried to follow it, and that was the first time I saw that like, you're doing too much shit, pick a few things that work and make them heavy, Yeah. And the thing that's what he guys would go, hey, I can't get my triceps to grow. I'm just using this as an example. I can't get my triceps to grow. And he'd say, well, what do you close grip bench right now for a set of 8? Well, I had 225. He's like, get your close grip bench to 315 for a set of 8, and then come back. Tell me if your triceps didn't grow. And it's like, that's the mindset you want to cultivate when you're trying to train for hypertrophy. It's like, my legs are small. Okay, what do you squat? 225 for 5. Okay, get your squat to 405 for 5. And then come back. Are your legs going to be bigger than they are today? Yeah, they are. They're going to be bigger. And it doesn't matter to me. I've always told guys, look, it's that end result. It's if you get that squat from 225 for 5 to 405 for 5, you're going to have grown. Whether you did that with high volume or low volume or 2 days a week or 1 day a week, I don't really care about that. Like, just find a way that works for you and get that number up. Like that's going to be, at the end of the day, that's going to be, whether you squat 2 days a week or 3 days a week or 1 day a week is less important than did whatever methodology you use make those numbers move. Yeah. And that makes me think of two things here. So first, we've talked a lot about basic general strength of the barbell lifts, and why that's important. We've all hammered it at length on our own podcasts, our own content, etc. But I just want to kind of revisit something here at the guys that they want to look better, they want to get bigger, and this also ties into where I personally have found not necessarily in the singles, but spending time with triples has been useful in my post-novices. I'll get guys that just, on the deadlift specifically, this is where I place a lot of priority, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. But for me, I've always squatted since I got out of high school. I've been benching since I was in high school, and I've done pull-ups since high school because I was a swimmer, so we had to do those movements. We just didn't squat. But so I noticed, okay, my lats would get bigger, my chest would get bigger, my quads would get bigger, right? But my delts weren't growing, my back wasn't growing thick, I should say. What do they call it? Back thickness in the physique circles. I wasn't getting that, and I did every type of row variant possible. And just as an aside, what I was about to say about when I read Dog Crap and tried to do that 20 years ago, what was missing from a lot of these programs, honestly, that I've gotten from Starting Strength was microloading, because people just didn't do it unless you're a weightlifter. And I've been following a template that you have on your website, the arm specialization one, and I've microloaded every single one of those movements, and I've taken my side raises from 10s to 20s for sets of 20 over an 8-month period. So that's what was missing back then, I thought. And for me, I was like I said, I was bottom heavy, top small. I would peter out at lifts that a lot of these guys that I was looking at that looked more jacked, that were lifting more, they'd leapfrog past these numbers. It wasn't so they never had to think about microloading, because they would fuck around to a 225, 245, 275 bench, going 5 pounds at a time, because different structure, different limitation. They weren't limited by gross strength at these lifts. I didn't understand that at the time. So the microloading really helped. But back to the
the microloading thing, I think, and Dante used to say this, and it's 100. He was the only guy talking about this at the time. Was you need to find the 2.5 pound plates in your gym, because that was. And I tell you what, when I first started, that was me. I mean, when I would bench your whatever lift I was doing, I'd be benching 225. Well, what was the next increment? 275, of course, right? I mean, you load in quarters and plates, man, and you just do 225.
I thought you were going to say 235.
No, fuck no, dude. Plates and quarters, and honestly, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I got to decent numbers kind of doing that, but I never thought, really until I got, met Rip, I didn't really ever think about a really progressive, on a smaller scale, a progressive routine like that, where you would go 225, 230, 235, 240, 245. But, to me, a 5 pound increment was microloading at the time. But depending on who you're talking to and what the movement is, that's where it's at. Cause that's really going to be, and a lot of people will say, I've heard that argument against microloading. Well, what's the difference between a set of 5 at 230 and 235? Like, does that really create that much more growth? I don't know, but I tell you this, you have to do it before you get to 240 and you have to do 245 before you get to 250. And so how much growth it creates, it's a necessary step. And for most people making those big jumps, like a lot of people do, if you're squatting 315 for 5 now, your next step is not 365.
Right. Yeah.
But that's how, I just think back, that was my mindset when I first started. I mean, it was all plates and quarters.
Yeah, sure.
And the microloading thing is really important, especially on small movements. Like side delt raises or, and especially small, biceps. Anything in a small muscle group that works in isolation like that is just not going to go up 5 to 10 pounds per session. And you have to eke out gains out of that, but that's how muscle is built.
Yeah, I thought I was being responsible back then. Just putting the 5s on, going up by 10 every time. And then I went down to 5s, but I learned through Rip that 5 was too big on a bench press, but really on a press or anything smaller than that. Yeah. I don't think I'd have the press that I have today without that. But I put the little quarter pounds on my notable dumbbells. That's how I go up by half per arm on those side raises, and it's worked, man. But I found, so when I started doing Starting Strength, I got a lot of growth out of the deadlift and the press, because I just wasn't training those movements. I didn't understand how you built back thickness. I thought you had to row your way there. And then I learned through various conversations with Rip, reading content, and just critical thinking, I'm like, okay, these are postural muscles. They work primarily isometrically, so the back needs to be loaded isometrically, especially in those early phases. So I have found the deadlift to be the driver of all other lifts, provided that you're doing it correctly, especially in those early phases. Obviously, this changes because it beats the piss out of you when you're more advanced. But early on, I make it a very big priority to try to get these guys to 405, for a set of 5, deadlifting over 400 pounds. So I might run up triples just to keep that intensity going.
Sure.
Then go back down, rework, and I just kind of really drill it in their head. I'm like, guys, this lift works everything from your neck to your ankles, but let's put lower body aside for now. It works everything from your neck to your ass, everything around your waist, your forearms. You're working a ton of upper body musculature in addition to all that lower body musculature that's getting hit as well. So, it's not as long of a range of motion as a squat, but again, your spine's in tension. You have to oppose that. All those muscles of the back grow. Your forearms grow. Your abs grow. Your obliques grow. And that's what a lot of these guys want, right? They want a nice upper body. And I'm like, go to a freaking powerlifting meet, man. Find a deadlifter that doesn't have big traps, a thick back, and nice set of abs. If you're looking at the guys that are like placing high in the deadlift, they tend to be leaner. They tend to be more jacked. Squats bit of the opposite. But
look at people criticize we kind of like you look at like say the IFBB pros like at the very top level. You say, well, we can't really learn anything from them because they're all genetically gifted, true, and they're all on massive amounts of PEDs, more so than any normal person is going to be willing to take or should take. And you say, so we really can't learn anything from those guys. But I would say, actually, I think that you can, because it's a level playing field for the most part. I mean, yeah, was Ronnie Coleman gifted? Of course. But was he more gifted than Flex Wheeler? No. Or any of the other guys that he competed against. But what was the thing that set Ronnie apart from everybody else? It was his back. He was was there anybody else on that stage that could do 800 for a double?
Right.
Nope. and when he used to say it, he used to say, as soon as I turn around, the show's over. Because it's like everybody, you're like, oh yeah, they look pretty good. And then like they turn around for a rear double bicep. You're like, yep, there's the winner. Yeah. Like not even close. And so what was the difference? Nobody else at that time was training that way. And even Jay Cutler said, he was running up second and third place at Mr. Olympia. He couldn't beat Ronnie. And they said, well, what did he do? He said, I went back to the big lifts. He's like, that's how I started. But then I got with everybody else. I was doing the cables and the machines and the kind of the pumpy stuff, and then it was like, in order to beat him, he went back and was like, I'm going to run my deadlift up to, whatever he was doing, 700 for reps or whatever, in order to compete at that same level. And so even at the most advanced stages, it still has its place. Now Ronnie didn't spend most of his training sessions doing 800-pound doubles, but he could do it, and he did do it occasionally. And that was, so I think it does make a difference, and it is something that the younger guys who are obviously not at that level and all that, that's something that you can take away.
Yeah, I remember in his back training, his famous back training video, you can look up on YouTube, he does 800 for a double, and then he walks over to the barbell row and works up to 495. For 10 or something. Yeah.
And that's the other thing, like Robert was saying, we talked about a base of strength earlier, like, when you talk about like, say the deadlift being, like those postural muscles that need to be strong isometrically like that. Like when you develop the bigger squat and the bigger deadlift, especially, you're setting yourself up to have a better platform for doing some of these other movements later that are going to contribute a lot more. Like you're not like, I don't know if you guys have like done a lot of like real heavy barbell rows, not like pendulum rows that reset on the floor, but like heavy barbell rows where you're having to anchor yourself and suspend, say 315 or more from your arms and row it. Like you can't have your lower back be the limiting factor for that. Like it has to be able to hold that posture. You have to be able to, that's the barbell row is really hard to teach, because the first thing you have to teach guys is how to anchor that position so that you can actually row in that bent over position and not have everything other than your lats gas out first. And that's why for a lot of people, a barbell row is not a great movement for hypertrophy, because the target muscle is like the last thing that gets stimulated. If you're trying to build up the lats and the upper back, it's like everything fails before that. And that makes it not a good movement. But if you're strong enough to anchor yourself to where you can row 315, or in Ronnie's case, 495 for a set of 10, which is ridiculous. The primary the primary the target muscle that he's trying to work is actually the thing that's fatiguing out and not those other things. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Dude, you took the next topic out of my mouth, man. Like,
right.
I was literally going to say a variation of that to lead into the fact that I gave up on rows because of what you're talking about. I wasn't getting anything out of them, and this was pre-starting strength. I never built up my deadlift. I had built up my squat to a decent place for what I was doing. I squatted 315 right before the linear progression. And I was benching 215 for a set of 5, I think, at the time, but I never got my deadlift past 315, which I thought was heavy. And because I was doing it wrong, I'm like, well, what's the point of this shit? It's a lower back exercise, which means I was rounding,
Yeah.
So I would just do it like a few times a year, right? Now, now we're in another year. So last year, 2022, Mike Minningel's like, I'm doing Baker's arm program. Give it a shot, So I did, and then I did the arm stuff, and I'm like, all right, 3 sets. I'm going to listen to him because I've heard Andy say that these bodybuilders overtrain too much. So I'm just going to do the 3 sets on the arm isolation stuff, which I'm glad I did. I don't have any crazy tendonitis. But I got to the back day, and, this is my second time running it. I'm on the last phase. So this will be 30 weeks of this thing. And what I'll say is that a couple of things. Number one, curling has never felt better. When I used to curl when I was younger, I hated it because my forearms would fatigue, and I didn't know this at the time, but I don't think I was very good at stabilizing my body while I was curling because I didn't have strong postural muscles at the time, but I wasn't so aware of that. So 2 things happened there. Number one, I came in with I probably can pull 550 if I, peak it out. I haven't done it in a while, but I'm a mid-500s deadlifter, and I'm going in and doing this program now. And my posture is not an issue. I can hold my body in place. I do a bit of swinging that anybody's going to do on a curl, but nothing crazy. I'm not turning it into a reverse clean. But, I have more control over that, so it's more focused on the biceps. The second thing that I kind of added in there, I had a client. I've talked about this in several episodes, but I haven't told you this. Client was complaining about hand pain, and I'm like, yeah, get some hand grippers. And I'm like, I got that old COC Captain's a Crush hand gripper I meant to use 15 years ago and never did. I'm going to bring it in and show it to you. So I start fucking with this thing in the car. It's the guide, the 60-pound one. I'm doing super high reps with it. I'm like, let's try to go up. So I'm just driving, fucking with these things. Then I go in, I'm like, week 4 of your program, and I'm like, what the fuck? Curls and rows got like super easy. I got to make bigger jumps now, So I used to hate rowing because A, my forearms would gas, so I really didn't feel anything in my lats, and B, I didn't have the strong hamstrings and the strong back to stay in position. This time around, the second thing wasn't an issue. I can hold myself in position just fine, but just working on that grip strength a little bit, this is the only time ever that I've gotten anything out of rows or bicep curls, and it's in large part because of squat and deadlift strength, press strength, of course, but then, I added in the hand grip stuff last minute and got better proprioception, better connection with the bar. And that's the whole point I want to drive at. If you have a strong deadlift, I think a lot of other things are easier because, as I wrote in one article, I got an article on the Starting Strength website. The title was "Your Back is Never Off the Clock." Every single exercise is a back exercise.
Yeah, that's to a broader point about, and this is one thing I've tried to beat into my guys that are physique oriented, is that when you're training for physique, when you're doing an exercise, I would say the exception are things like deadlifts, which are, when you're deadlifting, even if your goal is physique, you're not really thinking about, okay, I need to feel my hamstrings extend, and then I need to feel my hamstrings extend my hips, and I need to feel you just lift it from point A to point B, right? And the muscles that need to be worked are going to be worked. And that's what makes these things great novice exercises, is they actually don't require any mind-muscle connection.
Right.
It's just mechanics. Like when you squat, you just need to teach somebody, here's where you squat down to, and then you stand up. Like, you don't have to focus on what's doing the work. You just execute the movement, and the right muscles are going to do the work. And that works really, really well for novices who don't have good connection with their bodies yet. They don't necessarily, but when you get a little bit more advanced and you start looking at developing individual muscle groups, there's a couple of things. One, the target muscle that you're working has to be the muscle that is, quote, failing or fatiguing. And if you're doing an exercise and some other peripheral area of your body is failing first, you're getting a very suboptimal stimulus on the muscle that you're trying to work. And so that's why I always tell my guys, I'm like, you need to wear straps when you train your back. You need to wear lifting straps. And they're like, well, I want to get my forearms to grow. I'm like, no, you don't understand. If you're not going to row 495 is a ridiculous example, but you're not going to row 315 with a double overhand grip for sets of 10 without straps. Your forearms are going to fatigue first. So you're never actually approaching limit strength on the muscle that you're trying to work. So, I mean, you look at most guys that when they're training back, I mean, everybody pretty much wears straps, for most movement. And it's not a question of whether you need the straps. I mean, you can do it. You can probably do some things without straps, but you're going to be limiting yourself unnecessarily. It's like, it's like guys who refuse to switch to like a mixed grip or a hook grip on the deadlift.
Right.
They want to stay with double overhand forever. And it's like, why? You're limiting yourself. You're making the grip the limiting factor of this lift, and you're leaving all these gains on the table. Like how heavy are most guys going to be able to get on a double overhand deadlift? Like they're going to stall out. And then as soon as you switch them to a mixed grip or a hook grip or let them use a pair of straps, I mean, they put another 200 pounds on it, right? So why would you let the grip be the limiting factor on a deadlift that has so much potential? But the same thing could be applied to lesser exercises. Barbell rows, dumbbell rows, even pull-ups. Like, it's not a matter of whether you can do it without straps. It's that you're going to get a better stimulus on your lats if you can relax your grip and let your forearms be less of a limiting factor and less of a contributor. Every single guy that you'll ever train that doesn't have a good back, and especially new guys, when they come off of any type of back exercise, whether it's lat pull downs, they cannot feel their back. They cannot. Every time they come off the pull down machine, where's the pump? The forearms. That was the limiting factor. They don't know how to train the back. And if you learn how to relax the grip and let the lats do the work, you're going to get a better stimulus out of that exercise. So, and that applies to a lot of things. That can apply to, high repetition, low bar squatting. Where's the fatigue coming in a given lifter? For some guys, it may be the legs, but for a lot of guys, it might be the back.
Back.
And so what is that? Would that then be a great stimulus for developing the legs? High rep, low bar squats. Would that be the best stimulus if that's the limiting factor? Just like the same reason we don't necessarily want to do, maybe 20s. What's going to be the limiting factor for a lot of? Well, your cardio. So why you don't want? You know what I'm saying? You want you want the limiting factor to be the musculature of the muscle that you're trying to work. And so that's one of the things that changes, I think, from a guy that's like a novice to earlier intermediate to starting to go into that more advanced stage, is that you have to start thinking a little bit more like that. And it's your exercises are going to be, and this is what makes them like a barbell row. I don't think is a great exercise for a novice. I just don't think they have the strength. I don't think they have the mind-muscle connection to do it. They're just going to, I don't like pin lay rows either. Anyways, I hate that exercise for hypertrophy. I think
what I've been doing.
I don't. I mean, some guys. I mean, you look at like Mike. I mean, like Israel. I follow him, and but if you look at the way he does like a barbell row to the floor, it's very controlled, and the tension is not released off of that. When you look at the way most guys, it's not that I hate the pin lay row. I hate the way most guys do them. It's not a great stimulus for hypertrophy. For the lats especially, it's decent for the erectors and the mid back, but for like the lats, there's better exercises to do for the lats for sure than a pin lay row. And some of that has to do with structure. I mean, some guys can do a given exercise and they're like, man, this just blows up body part X. And another guy does it and he just doesn't get that same connection to it. And so, like that
rows.
Yeah. I mean, and that was like with me, I've always used this example, and I like to do it because it gets a little bit of attention, but I talk about like low bar squatting. Like for me, like low bar squatting is not a great movement for my quads, because it's, in terms of like for a more advanced, at a more advanced place, I've already built up a lot of strength on there. You know what I'm saying? And so like I look at, okay, low bar squatting, where, like if I take a set to failure, like what's failing and where is the majority, like the next day, like where's all the soreness at? Like soreness is not necessarily something that we chase, but it can be a good indicator of where where an exercise is hitting, and for me, like I always talked about, like when I low bar squatted, when I got at my strongest, where I was all ass and adductors.
Yeah,
you know what I
right.
mean? It's a great movement for the posterior chain. But like if I was going to go into competitive bodybuilding, like my focus would shift off of low bar squatting into, high bar pause squats, hack squats, things like that really where the stress is all directed into the muscle that I'm going to train. And again, it's no different than that the mindset is no different than if we're talking about an Olympic weightlifter, where what works at the beginning, for a novice and early intermediate, it's going to shift in emphasis over time, where you're going to have to get more specific to, let's say, quote, the sport or the endeavor.
So, on that note, what are some of your go-to movements then? And let's narrow this down. Let's talk about upper body in particular. So, we've got a guy, he's an early intermediate. He has, reached that sort of, low 200s bench press mark that we talked about earlier, but he's not seeing his chest fill out in the way that he wants to, or, his delts need to fill out a little bit, triceps need to fill out. What are some of your go-to movements that you're going to reach for?
Well, and some of it may be, and this is where just a basic understanding of muscle function really comes into play. Some of it may, I think the bench press is really good. I think the way, so a lot of it may be changing exercises, and some of it may be just changing the technique of a given exercise. Let's take the bench press, for example. The way that a lot of powerlifters bench makes it not a great movement for hypertrophy. When you're for the chest, when you're hitting, you take a huge arch in your back. You maximize the amount of arch that you can do. You take a really wide grip. You bring the bar down really low onto the top of the belly or whatever, and then you have that J curve where you're taking it, not in a straight line but back up. All you got to do is watch a guy do that and watch what his pecs are doing. What's the role of the pectoral muscle? I mean, what does it do? It abducts the humerus in. How much of that is actually happening in the way that some guys bench press? And when you look at a lot of guys, you look at it and you go, there's just not a lot of pec activation in that movement. It doesn't necessarily mean that the bench is a bad movement, but the way that he's benching is not great for pec hypertrophy. So you take a guy like that, you flatten him out a little bit on the bench, you still arch a little bit, but maybe not quite as dramatically. You change the touch point a little bit to where you're bringing up a little bit higher. The elbows are a little bit more flared out. Now you watch what the pec is doing. Now the pec is actually functioning in its role of abducting the humerus in, and he's gonna bench a set of, he's gonna probably use a little less weight, but he's creating more stress on the pec. And that's the difference in powerlifting versus bodybuilding is you're still going to try to do as much weight as you can in a given rep range, but you're not just saying in powerlifting, it's just touch the chest anywhere and lock it out.
Right.
But that's not for bodybuilding. There's a different criteria, hitting really low on the belly and pushing the bar back, over the face is not going to be the greatest technique in the world for a lot of people. Some of that depends on your build, and so I think that's where in the powerlifting world, this volume shit came from, was they're using a really bad exercise to try to develop hypertrophy. And so the answer was, well, I just do more sets. And it's like, well, you don't need more sets. You need a better exercise, or you need a better technique that's actually better for stimulating the pec. So the bench press may be fine. Now, even better than that would be, if you look at the mechanics of it, a dumbbell bench press or certain types of converging chest press machines, the hammer strength line. I mean, there's so many machines now. I don't even, know them all, but there's a million makes and models of, say, converging type chest presses, which actually really, really emphasizes that abduction of the humerus and really, really makes the pec go through its actual full range of motion. So you have things like benching, dumbbell benching, converging chest pressing machines. All of those things, they fit the criteria. They can be loaded over time, And then you've got things like, I usually switch guys over or add in incline work, So there's always been that debate forever about, I guess they call it now
wonders, yeah.
Yeah, and what they call now, regional hypertrophy.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that next.
Yeah, so this is another case where I think bro science won out, because bro science for years said, you got to train a muscle from different angles. Like you can't just do one, like you got to do bench, you got to do incline, and so they were notionally correct. Right. I don't think it's like a lot of bro science is correct. It's just the explanation for it is not right.
Yeah. They talk about the upper pec muscle.
Well, right. There is. I mean, there's if you look at the fibers, there's a clavicular head of the chest, and the fibers run a different direction than the sternal head, and so when you look at stressing those fibers optimally, it turns out that like you're not going to stress those fibers optimally doing nothing but flat pressing. And so we're talking about, optimal here. You were trying to maximize every bit of growth that we can possibly get. You're going to need probably a flat stimulus, or a slight decline might be even better. I mean, Dorian was famous for saying, get rid of flat benching. Everything should be done at a slight incline and a slight decline. And if you actually look at the way that Dorian was ahead of his time, he's actually pretty smart, and you look at the way that the pec fibers lay out, he's actually kind of correct in that, like that a slight decline and an incline might actually be a better stimulus overall than a flat, And so a lot of guys adhere to that. And so you look at the you look at the way the fibers lay out, and you can kind of start developing some exercises for that. But I'd say for most people, something like, something from a flat angle, something at an incline angle, whether that's a dumbbell incline press or a barbell incline press. Again, there's no shortage of machines. Kind of find one that you feel works. And if you like, I don't know how much time you guys have spent doing this, but if you take a guy that's done nothing but flat benching and you have him, knock out a few sets of inclines, and he does them correctly, a couple of things happen. One, he gets up from that first or second set and he goes, fuck, I've got a pump in my chest like I've never felt before. Well, why is that happening? Well, I'd say he's probably stimulating some muscle that he hasn't really stimulated that well in the past. So he's feeling something pretty novel here. So it hasn't been optimally stressed just through flat benching. And then he's going to have a different soreness pattern the next day. So so a lot of guys knock the pump stuff and the soreness stuff. And I think guys think about it wrong. They think of both of those things as causative, that the pump and the soreness is actually like, that's the end state. Like, we just want to see how much of a pump we can get and how sore we can get. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think they're indicators. I think they can be indicators of how effective a stimulus is. So when you can feel those, and you can go overboard with that for sure, but it is an indicator that something, something novel is happening. That's like the new nerd term. It's like novel stress, which that's like the smart way of like, the Weider's old muscle confusion principle, right? That's like that was like, oh, you can't confuse a muscle. Now they just call it novel stress.
Novel stress.
But they're kind of saying the same thing. And granted, the Weider stuff was stupid, right? Like, you don't need 20 different angles to train your chest, but you might need 2 or 3, And so I usually hit chest the way that I have guys do it is like something flat, something incline, and then something more kind of for that costal outer region, whether it's a dip or like a cable fly from top to bottom. And that's pretty much it. You kind of hit that, like that's kind of pretty much it for there. So, but I like bench pressing. I can't do that much of it anymore because I've got a recurring shoulder injury that just I can only string together so many sessions before I start having problems there. But benching is fine. It's just the way that you do it, I think, needs to be. If you're benching a lot and you're not getting the pec hypertrophy that you want, look at the technique of the bench first, and you may need to alter the technique a little bit. And then other than that, it's adding in things like dumbbell work. That it allows for a little deeper range of motion. You get more bottom end stretch, which I think is an important component of a good hypertrophy exercise. Like, does it include a decent bottom end stretch, and does it take the muscle through a fairly full range of motion? And so sometimes certain dumbbell and machine exercises do a better job of that than barbell stuff does.
So it made me think of something. So we've talked about the bench, we've talked about the squat, we've talked about the deadlift. One of the things that I have noticed in myself and virtually every novice that I've taken through a linear progression, and intermediates that just weren't training it, was that the press is highly effective at building all 3 heads of the deltoid if you are a novice or possibly undertrained intermediate. And I come at this from the standpoint that I used to do just like I said, I did every type of row, I did every type of raise, and I always got good anterior deltoid development from benching and dips and that shit, and posterior from pull-ups and pulls of various kinds. But then, muscle would look flat from the side. No monolateral raises would change that. When I found starting strength and ran up my press, it finally filled out. And then when I started training other people, I started seeing the same thing over and over again. I'd get girls that did bikini shows. They were doing all the same shit that I used to do. A bunch of raises, cable raises, things like that. get them to start pressing, that deltoid head pops out. My girlfriend is one of them. She is always getting dinged on her delts. So I had her press more, filled right out. And I feel like this lift kind of gets ignored in those circles. The press is largely ignored in physique circles. I've even heard guys say, oh, it's great for transfer to function, but it's not great for hypertrophy. Which, who are we talking to is the first thing that comes to my mind now, because I understand where that statement might have context. But I think that the overhead movements are almost essential as a base, since that's what we've been talking about a lot today. I think that's a base for building the shoulders. And
well, sure, and I think it goes back to just answer that simple question for yourself. If you take a guy that's new, and he's got a 95 for 5 press, or let's even say a 135 for 5 press, and you get him to 185 for 5, what's going to happen to his delts? They're going to grow.
They're going to grow.
And to some guys, it's like any other exercise. Some guys may experience more than others. Some guys may get more or less complete development from that and not need anything else. I mean, look at a lot of CrossFitters. They do a lot of overhead press work with the bar, and a lot of them have some pretty jacked shoulders if you look at it. Shoulder. The other thing with shoulders is that your amount of leanness plays a lot into that. Like if you've got even a little bit of body fat or water on top of that, it can make your shoulders look like canned hams, but when you start leaning out a little bit, like they start taking on that shape. So that's where leanness really comes into it, where, you may not be seeing everything that's there because it's one of those muscles where even a little bit of water or fat over the top of it really obscures what the delts actually look like. Some muscles are just like that. So, and that's one of them, but I think a lot of it is in bodybuilding circles, the press with the barbell press was historically always done seated on a vertical bench. And that's a really shitty bar path. Like if you've ever done a seated barbell press,
that's terrible.
On a real, like a high incline press would be better.
Yeah.
Actually,
right.
Like lean that incline back a little bit would actually be a much better developer of the front delt. But when you're doing it from a seated position, with like the back support behind you, it's actually because you get this moment arm in front of you where you can't get your head and your face out of the way. So you're having to loop that bar out in front, and it just cuts. It's just a bad range of motion. I mean, it's just hard to really get anywhere on that. So a standing press, or if you're going to do seated, now some of the old school gyms had these where like you had the seated military press. They used to call them the seated military press units that had a really low back support. So it didn't go all the way up your spine. Like it stopped like in your mid back. And then you could kind of mimic what you do on a standing overhead press, which is get a little bit of that layback in order to get your head and your face out of the way. Now, I think like on a strict military press for the shoulders, like if we're talking about hypertrophy, a standing overhead press with a barbell is a great exercise. I think where guys fuck it up, I think too much layback makes it not so great, because again, you're just taking stress off of the target muscle. Yes, you're moving the weight from point. That's why I don't like the starting strength model, like what they call it, the 2.0 press, or like now you've got like this crazy stuff like with double laybacks and all that. Like if your goal is to press the most weight over your head, that's not a bad way to do it, because you're incorporating more musculature. But at the same time, you're potentially taking stress off of the delts doing that. You're bringing other things into that. So the deltoid itself is not the primary mover, and it's not always a limiting factor in that movement. So I prefer from a hypertrophy standpoint, a stricter press with a much more moderate amount of layback. And that really keeps the tension on the delts. And that's my preferred way to do it. I mean, just the same way that we would say a push press or a jerk is not the greatest movement for shoulder hypertrophy. I mean, is there some? Yeah, sure. Would that be your preferred go-to movement for shoulder hypertrophy? Probably not. Well, why so? Well, you're bringing in a lot of other shit that doesn't have anything to do with the delts. Like, make the delts do the work, and I tell a lot of my guys that are doing the bodybuilding stuff like that, like if you're pressing, you need to make the delts, if that's what you're trying to grow, then they need to be doing the work in the exercise, not all this other stuff. So if you're turning your press into a standing bench press and then going, why aren't my delts growing? Well, that may be it. Just the same as on the bench press. If you're doing one of those crazy, super high arch, really low touch point type, super wide grip powerlifting style, yeah, you can maybe potentially move more weight, which is good in a meet, but it's not the greatest stress on the pectoral muscle. Just the same, and the same thing might apply to an overhead press. The same thing might apply to a squat. You're talking about what is the best movement. So you wanted to break it down by body part. I'd say for a more advanced guy who's built, let's say, his low bar squat up to a certain point, switching your style to like a deeper high bar pod squat in order to train your quads, that may be a better stimulus for a lot of people. I know for me it was, because just the way that I'm built, I always make the joke, I'm all adductors and ass on a low bar squat. So if I'm training, if my intention for the day is to try to create a stimulus that makes my quads grow beyond where they're currently at, then, the low bar squat may or may not be the best movement for me. And I think that's where you see like limit. So things change as you get more advanced, right? Like at the beginning, we talked about the best thing is just get stronger on the basic lifts. But then there's a point of diminishing returns on that. When you get to a certain point, like I was like a mid-5 low bar squatter, right? Okay, so could I have gotten, so let's just call it 550, okay? Is like best low bar squat. What and my quads were not really, that well developed at that point. It's a pretty decent squat, but my quads weren't really all that, weren't greatly developed from that. So they weren't small, but if I was going to step onto a bodybuilding stage, that would have been an area that I would have needed to bring up. So would I get more out of saying, okay, well, I'm going to take this 550 low bar squat and I'm going to push it to 575. Am I going to cross some sort of threshold that now all of a sudden makes my quads grow even more than they have? Or did I already hit kind of the upper limit with that? You don't really know. And there's limitations on strength. You say, well, just take your squat from 550 to 650. Well, maybe I can't do that. You know what I mean? So,
right. This is where I'm at now.
Like John Meadows had that approach. Like I heard John Meadows talk a lot about that. He was, he would always say like, yes, like the answer is just get stronger, but you're going to hit like when you're 35, 40 years old, maybe you hit your peak on strength. Like, in theory, it sounds good. Well, just move your deadlift from 600 to 700. Well, yeah, but
right.
maybe I can't, maybe I can't do that. And maybe the time spent doing that is not the best. It's not the best. It's just like in track, right? I don't know if you've spent time you have to get like a track, like 100-meter sprinter, right? You got to get the guy stronger, right? Like, and when they first start, like a young kid, most of the time, the best way to get him faster is to get him stronger. But once, let's say you get a kid to a 500-pound squat, like, and he still needs to get faster. Like, should you switch to something more specific towards that goal? Or should you say, well, we need to just keep pushing strength? Like, you're going to hit a point where there's a diminishing returns of we just got to get stronger on these basic lifts. Like, you have to get a little bit more specific. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And they're also like, kind of baked into that is that there's such a high cost of pursuing that incremental strength at that point. Moving your squat from 550 to 600 comes with huge fatigue costs that stop you from training something else. Yeah,
it's just like with any sport, there's no such thing as being too strong. It's only the acquisition of more strength that's potentially problematic at a certain level. Because at a certain level, the amount that for that 25-pound increase in your squat, like how much faster is that going to make you? Like, is that going to be the thing that knocks down your 100-meter time? Or is it, and just so it's just like in bodybuilding, like is putting another 25 pounds on your low bar squat, your powerlifting squat or whatever, is that going to be the thing that all of a sudden makes your quads explode into a new level of growth? Or would you get more out of it going and, like I did, convert over to a high bar squat and sinking those things rock bottom, actually taking the quads through a complete and full range of motion, really emphasizing the stretch at the bottom, taking the hams and the glutes and the adductors out of the movement a little bit more, and then progressing that in the same way. So maybe you go down to the first time you do that, you do 315 for 5, and then you take the same approach. You go, okay, well, I'm kind of weak at these. Like, I kind of suck at this variation of the squat. So why don't I push this from 315 for 5 to 405 for 5 to 455 for 5? And that type of approach is what really started to make certain body parts grow on me that were stagnated, was just switching that approach. And so you've got to make that muscle that you're trying to train the limiting factor, or it's not going to grow. So talked about that with back training, deadlifts, rack pulls, all of those things are going to be good. And then, but they may not give you complete development of the lats after a certain point. You're going to have to add more stuff in, that sort of thing. So
yeah. Now I have a question for you on that though. So let's say we've got a guy here who is squatting 315 for 3 sets of 5, and he's doing that low bar. And he converts over to a high bar squat, but he really sucks at them. So he's only high bar squatting, let's say 245, 250. It probably could do more than that, but let's just say that that's where he is. So when you have that much of a drop off, without getting into like programming specifics, would you have that guy just only high bar squat at that point and just and basically just LP or linearly progress that 250 high bar squat up to near 315? Or would you leave in some low bar work from time to time to make sure he's still getting that stimulus? Because there's going to be a drop off in the strength stimulus, right?
Yeah, and so I did this. One of the great things about not having competitive aspirations anymore is I do a lot of self-experimentation. And so I posted a thing on Instagram maybe a year back or whatever. If I was doing, really deep high bar pause squats on the Smith machine. Okay. And of course, everybody, because they know like my back, they're like, oh, look, Baker converted over to the Smith machine. Like that's what he's advocating. No, I'm like, I'm bored with my training. And so it's a form of self-experimentation to see, knowing what I know now, if what I think in my head is correct, and it's easier to experiment on yourself than other people, because especially if you're kind of in tune, you kind of know what's going on. So I did an experiment where I took that, which by the way, if you've never done that, it's actually like a lot of people knock the Smith machine, but like a deep high bar pause squat, like it's actually brutally fucking hard on the quads. And so I ran that up like as high as I could on there. And I got as strong as I possibly could on there. And the first few times I did them, like my quads were wrecked. It felt like the first time that you did a LP or that level of soreness. Like this is obviously a stimulus that they haven't gotten before. And I got really, really, really strong on that. Did not continue to low bar squat. Went back to the low bar squat. And what do you think happened to my low bar squat?
Went up.
It tanked.
Oh, it tanked.
Okay.
It tanked.
Yeah.
It tanked. And so that was from a strength standpoint. Now, it's not like I reverted all the way back to 225, but I was definitely not at my peak. And I think it's just as simple as specificity. You get better at what you train. And when you don't train something for a long period of time, the only exception to that for me is my deadlift. I actually think I'm one of those guys who almost does better not deadlifting, but I think that I'm one of the exceptions to that, not the rule. But the carryover from that, and I think a lot of it was a lot of the other musculature wasn't necessarily being trained, and I think the lack of or the stability created by the Smith machine was a huge detriment to my strength in the barbell squat. And so it just has to do but that stability added in that you get from say a hack squat or a Smith machine squat or whatever actually is a good thing when it comes to, it can be a good thing when it comes to hypertrophy, but it's not good. That's why I would never train like an athlete that way, or just a guy that wants to be functionally strong. I would keep 99% of what we're doing free weight based, barbells and dumbbell based, because I think there's a lot to just having, that just you and the barbell out in space. And everybody always talks about the stabilizer muscles, and I hate that term. But it's not that there's a different set of muscles that are working necessarily. It's that they're not being asked to do as much. And so when you go back and you try to have all that intramuscular coordination that it takes to push a really, really heavy squat up, you have to train that. But I would say, if I was a bodybuilder, I would say mission accomplished. I would say the fact that my low bar squat went down a little bit was not necessarily because my quads grew. And if you're a physique athlete, then that's the only thing that matters. Nobody, when you're on the bodybuilding stage, nobody cares what you squat. They just care about what you're, what you look like. And so that at that point, I felt like, that was a good thing for me where I was at coming off of a mid 500 squat. It wouldn't have been a good choice for, a guy that has I don't think they would have got the same thing out of that, doing Smith machine or leg press or whatever. I think it's one of those things. I always liken it to academics, and, Robert's a PhD, right? So he's going to understand this probably better than anybody. When you start on an academic pathway, grade school, high school, or whatever, your education is more general in nature, right? As it should be. You don't start off in high school. If you want to have a PhD in chemistry, you don't start off, your freshman year of high school doing advanced chemistry. You do
I didn't even take chemistry,
right? You do you do math, reading, science, you get a broad base of education, right? And then you go into your undergraduate work, and it's still kind of broad, right? You still got to do, even if your goal is to have a PhD in some sort of chemistry, you're still going to take some physics. You're still going to take some biology. You're still going to take some math. Like, you're still going to do a lot of that kind of stuff. You're still going to need to improve your reading skills, like all of those things. But the farther up you go, the less biology and physics you're going to take, and the more advanced chemistry you're going to take. And I think there's a lot you can think of in terms of kinds of how an education works, going from broad and general at the bottom to being much more narrowly focused at the top. And so you may, as an advanced chemistry student, you may forget a little bit of that biology and physics that you knew in your undergraduate work, but that's okay. You don't necessarily you remember what you need to remember. And I think training has a lot. There's that analogy works for training a lot. And so that's kind of what I tell some of my advanced guys.
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
So one last question before we kind of wrap up, and it's one that we've all gotten at some point in time. Bringing all this home, one of the most common questions I get when we're talking about growth is, how much muscle can a human add to his frame? And this is assuming no drugs. And I know there's no one answer to this question because I've had to answer it many times. But, one of the reason I ask it is, one of the things that I get is, well, bro, you're not even big. What the fuck do you know? And my response lately has been, if you look, I need to post my before more often. I don't do that quite hardly enough, but if you kind of look at where I started to where I've come, my experience with all this has been that each year, I started out baseline skinny fat. Each year I get less skinny, a little more jacked, but I'm not turning into a big giant fucking beast. And my experience training others is most people kind of respond the same way. There's, a small to modest delta, and then you get guys that are just hyper fucking responders. Then you get our motor morons that, God love them, will put us to work for several years, So I just wanted your take on that.
Well, it's like any other sport. Genetics play a role. And your willingness to, especially when you work with a little bit older population and you talk about weight gain. I always tell my clients, like, we know the more that you eat and the more scale weight you want to add, the more potential for muscle you want to have. At a certain point, though, you have to balance out your quest for more muscle with what you want to weigh, what you want your scale weight to be, because you have other considerations, in your life is just your health. How heavy do you want to be?
Right.
What kind of other activities are you involved in? And just, weighing more, how does that, I know, like, I'm kind of the same way, like, put on more muscle when I get heavier, but like my energy level throughout the day is not that great. And I have a lot to do during the day. I run 2 businesses and have 3 kids. And like, I feel a lot better at 205 than I do at 230, and so there's other considerations to weigh, and so if you're going to, a lot of it depends on how lean do you want to stay. If you want to keep abs in the, like a good set of abs in the mirror year round, you're going to be limiting your growth to some degree. To stack on 20 pounds, to add on 20 pounds of purely fat. I just had this conversation yesterday with a client.
Yeah. This is the question.
He doesn't want to put on 1 single ounce of body fat or water. And I'm like, dude, for a guy that's 40 something years old of average genetics, to think
love these guys, Trent.
like to put on 20 pounds of fat-free mass, I don't think you will understand how hard that is. Like, it's near, I would say it's bordering on impossible. It's bordering on impossible with the way that,
Trent loves these guys.
Yeah. This reminds me.
Here's the thing, what people don't understand, like, even if you don't lift, if you just get really fat, like, you're actually going to put on some muscle.
Yeah,
absolutely. Like, without even lifting. And people don't want to hear that. And I'm not advocating that you should get fat, because I think there's drawbacks to that too, in terms of anabolism. Like there's things that happen when you're carrying way in excess adipose tissue that actually aren't that great for, like, your insulin sensitivity sucks.
Right.
And so there's lots of things. Robert could talk about this better than I could, but from my understanding of nutrition and all is actually being excessively fat is not great for muscle growth either. But to walk around with like a shredded 6-pack all day and think, well, I want to continue to add weight. Well, you're probably limiting yourself some. So some of it is you're going to have to smooth over a little bit in order to put on that kind of weight, and then peel a little bit of that off. And the what people don't understand about this thing, and people talk about it nowadays like it's commonplace, like this whole thing of we're gonna bulk and then cut, and we're gonna bulk and we're gonna do a mini cut, and then like people don't understand how fucking hard that is over a long period of time. Like the level of discipline that takes to, I'm gonna move my body weight up 20 pounds, a half pound per week, which is about what I would tell people. That's about the max you want to go up, is about a half pound to a pound per week. You can gain faster than that. I mean, I can gain 5 pounds overnight, easy, depending on, what, because I have almost an unlimited appetite. But it's not going to be quality weight. So if you want to add quality weight, and we're talking about a half pound to a pound per week of weight gain, you're still going to put on a little bit of body fat, even doing that very, very minimal increase. And so to push that up, that 20 pounds, I mean, you're looking at potentially 40 weeks. You're looking at almost the better part of a year of very, very slowly and methodically adding that weight, which takes a lot of discipline to keep it in that range, to be in a surplus, but in a very, very small surplus. And then to peel a little bit of that off, and then to go back up another 10 or 20, and then to peel a little bit off, and then to go back up another 20. You're talking about a multi-year process of very, very meticulous tracking of calories and macros and that sort of thing. And I think unless you're sufficiently motivated to do that through high levels of competition, it's going to be more than most people are willing to do in the reality. They may want to do that, but when you look at the reality of that, it's kind of like how it's like when somebody wants to get really, really lean. It's like, do you know what it's going to take to get that lean and stay that lean? And like, you really want to do that? Like, I want to drink a few beers on the weekend, and I want to eat a pizza on the weekend. Like, so I'm going to have to accept a certain amount of like, not leanness in order to live the lifestyle that I want to live. If I've been down really, 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 really low body fat before, and I know what that takes for me. And that's not a lifestyle that I'm willing to live. And I think most people have a hard time admitting that to themselves. They want it in theory, but when you really break it down of what does it actually take to do what you're asking to do, you're not willing to put in that kind of work, and it's just, so you have to, and that's why people go on PEDs, because it makes it a lot easier.
I was about to say that,
I mean, that's why steroids are popular, because it cuts a lot of time off of that pathway. But to do that as a natural trainee, I mean, just look at natural bodybuilding. I mean, a lot of those guys are, when you look at them, if you look at them, pre-contest in the final weeks and months leading up to a contest, and you see them in a t-shirt, a lot of them, you can't hardly tell they lift weights. They're not, they look pretty peeled when they take their shirt off, but they're not that big. And because as a natural guy, it's just hard to put on that amount of muscle mass and keep that level of leanness. And I think this is kind of an aside, but the natural bodybuilding sport, I think part of the problem with natural bodybuilding is they enforce the same standards of leanness that they do on the pros that are using all those anabolics. And you cannot get that lean without dieting off a significant amount of muscle. The pros can because of the drugs that they take. They can get down to almost, I don't know what percentage of body fat would you say those guys are? I mean,
on 4 or 5.
Yeah, but on stage it's even less. I mean, because it's just nothing,
Right.
And it's like for a natural to get down that low, you're going to have to peel off a lot of muscle mass. And so to think that you're going to, not only maintain that, but then add muscle mass in that, and to stay really, really lean. So you gotta come to grips with how much scale weight are you willing to gain? How much fat are you willing to accumulate? And, that's going to be different for everybody, and, the same thing could be said with strength. I mean, if you get a guy that's 6'1" and 180, and he's like, oh, I want to bench 315, and he's at 225. And it's like, man, with those long ass arms, 180 pounds may not be enough to move that, unless you got some insane genetics. It's going to be a tough ask unless you're willing to put on another 20, 30 pounds, and it's just, you need that amount. You need the leverages to improve in order to move that kind of weight. And it's just so, and a lot of guys don't want to do that. And I say, well, that's fine. Like, I'm not the guy that's going to tell you what you should weigh. That's your choice. You want to weigh, if you're 6'1", 180, like, that's fine. Like, I think that's a healthy weight, but it's not optimal for a strength athlete. And so if that's what you want to weigh, you're going to have to accept a certain amount of limitations on your absolute strength. And the same thing is true with muscle size. If you're not willing to push the scale weight up, these guys, if let's say a more normal guy that's 5'8" and, 165, I mean, he can look pretty good, but he's not going to be huge.
Yep. Right.
So, and if he wants to get up to 185, 205, that's possible. But to think you're going to do that all fat-free muscle mass, yeah, right. I mean,
this reminds me of when I was like 16 or 17. I was a football player. I played football in high school, and I am that guy. I am 5'8", and at the time I was 165, thereabouts. And I remember going to the GNC, and I was like looking for the like mass gainer 9,000 or whatever. And I'm talking to the guy at the front desk, and he's helping me pick something out. And he's like, "Oh, you just want to bulk up?" I'm like, yeah, I want to bulk up. He's like, "All right, here's what you need, man." And I was like, "But like lean, right?" And he's like, "You mean you want to put on lean mass? 10 pounds of lean mass?" And he's like, "Brother, you better get on steroids."
Yeah. Well,
and you know what? He was honest with me. I appreciate it. He was like,
no, I mean,
he's like, "Bro, you can bulk up, you can put on 20 pounds, but like, lean?" He's like, "If you book it in the gym, you might put on like 3 or 4 pounds." But he was like, "Get on steroids if you want more."
Get on steroids or have a genetic, a genetic profile of that of a guy that plays, that's a running back in the NFL.
Yeah,
the tip of the spear genetics. Now, can those guys add 10 or 20 pounds of lean muscle between the ages of 18 to 25?
Hell yeah, they can.
A lot easier than the rest of us can. And that's, and so that's again, you're talking about a different, and I would say a lot of the top bodybuilders, certainly at the pro level, have those types of genetics. In terms of, I mean, they're close, maybe not athletically necessarily, but in terms of muscle building potential, the ability to, consume a ton of calories and stay fairly lean. I mean, those guys have that. And this would be something we get into the podcast. I want to talk to you about the idea of the body type that, you always talked about the endomorph, mesomorph, ectomorph type of thing. And I've heard different things on that about, that's bullshit or that's true. But people fit a profile. I mean, I've always been I'm 5'4". And so for me, when I put on a little bit of muscle, that's why most bodybuilders are short. When I put on a little bit of muscle, it shows up, and that's an advantage for a guy of my height. For a guy that's 6'1", to put on 5 or 10 pounds of muscle, it doesn't show up the same way as it does, just like fat. If I gain 10 or 15 pounds of holiday bloat, that shows up a lot more on me at 5'4" than it does a guy that's 6'2". And so there's, you have to consider your genetics, and those guys at the top of the game, those guys that get really big and really lean, they've got the genetics to do so. And the rest of us don't. We can do all the stuff that they do, and we're not going to respond the same way. Even if we took the same drugs that they do. That's what gets me about diet is guys. They don't have the genetics of the pros. They're not on the drugs, and they think they can eat in a way that's less optimal than and it's like, dude, those guys are the genetic tip of the spear. They're on loads of PEDs, and they're still look at the way they eat. They're still forcing the protein and the quality carbs and all that. And you think you can get by, eating a sandwich for lunch and a bowl of cereal for breakfast and whatever mom makes for dinner, and you're going to get those. It's like you don't have any of the advantages that they do. And the one area that you can control, which is your diet, you're way less than optimal on there as well. And that's the other side of it, and this better than anybody. I mean, the training thing, that's just almost a small part of it. I mean, none of the stuff that we talked about today matters one bit if the nutrition is not in place.
100%.
Amen.
Amen. No, it's funny, Trent. Brother, you're going to need to get on steroids. I like that.
Yeah.
I appreciate the honesty.
So from 2016 to 2021, I just trained and paid no attention to body weight. I rarely weighed myself, and I was at the bottom of a cut. So it was interesting. When I ran starting strength 2013, 2015, I think I put, according to, based on BodPod, that's what I used to use back then, my lean mass changed by 7 pounds. So probably somewhere between 4 and 7, margin of error. So I gained quite a bit considering how long I'd been in the weight room at that point, just from probably driving my press and my deadlift up because I didn't really train those. My squat and bench went up too, just not by as large of deltas. Then after that, I started cutting some weight down. I started doing DEXAs. I did one in 2016. Then from 16 to 21, I just trained and didn't really get on a scale. I got, I think, as high as 190 to 195 range. I'm 5'9". My fat percentage was probably in the low 20s, possibly mid 20s at the highest. The waistline was 36. Then I cut down end of 21 and beginning of 22. And the funny thing is, pre-starting strength, I cut down to 150, 155. I wouldn't see much definition up top. After starting strength and a little intermediate work, I got down in the mid 160s. And I would see everything. I'd probably be like 12, 13% body fat, something like that. This last time, I was in the low 170s when I saw that level of definition. I didn't do any body comp tests. I didn't want to fucking pay for it. It's too damn expensive.
Right.
Because I'm trying to use the same DEXA, and they've raised their prices since because they're a sport med clinic, so they charge more. I don't want to deal with it. But the point is, it seems like every few years I've put on a few pounds of lean mass, and that's exactly what you're kind of outlining here when you're not at the tip of the genetic sphere, and you're doing this, the old-fashioned way without PEDs, just diet and exercise. It's like a multi-year fucking process to gain a few pounds, Yeah.
I mean, and that's why you gotta, you really, if you miss that window, it's kind of like, you hate to tell guys this, because I mean, you can't do anything about the past, but if you're looking to be like, if you miss that window of starting lifting, say in your teenage or college years, and you don't train hard through those years and through your, through your 20s and you don't pick this stuff up until, like, a lot of my clients, I'm sure like yours, like they've never touched a weight before until they're like late 30s and early 40s. And that also puts a limit, on what you can do. Like because of that, it takes a certain amount of years in order to get, in order to build all that mass. And so it can be done, but it's a tougher ask if you start really, really late in life. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, or that you can't put on an appreciable amount of muscle, but you're potentially leaving a lot on the table if you really want to optimize, like going back to your question of how much muscle can you put on. A lot of that is a little bit of luck. Is like, well, ideally, if you could start, on a good program, the earlier you can start, the better, just like saving money, right? I mean, if you don't start saving and investing until your 40s or 50s, like, I mean, you can still do it, but good luck. It's going to be a lot easier had you started that process 20 years ago. You're putting all those deposits on there. And, the nutrition side, you look at people like what we do, like with the novice linear progression, or even things like the Texas method and all that. It's like, why do some guys, you'd say, what's the differentiating factor? How come some guys, they get 6 weeks into the NLP and they start to kind of peter out already? Some guys get an easy 12. Some guys may go 6 months, with relatively few adjustments to training. What are the differences between those two? And I say more or less it's weight gain. I mean, it's you're continuously putting on weight will extend your ability to add the amount of muscle that allows you to keep continuously lifting more and more and more weights. Things like the Texas method as well, tend to respond better. And so some guys push that too fast. I mean, like, I think a lot of guys are, especially older guys, are just like, well, I just need to get up to, if I'm 180, I need to get up to 220 like tomorrow. I've never been, I've never liked that, like it can be done, but you're going to get stronger, but it's not the best way to go about it because you don't want to get really strong. And then also, like, I mean, we've all heard this complaint from people like in the starting strength community, right? Like, my squat went from, 135 to 365, but I'm fat as fuck now. Like,
right.
What I mean? Like, and it's like, well, you're going to like, they're going to want to peel that weight off at some point. And when you have to go through now a prolonged cut,
that
you're
sucks.
And you're going to wind up losing a lot of that strength that you built anyway. So it's like, you built it up to 365 or 405 or whatever. And now you've got to go through a 40-pound cut because you fat fucked yourself, and that's an old John Schaefer report. I love that. It's like you fat fucked yourself.
That's what I did. Yeah.
And well, a lot of people do, and they don't necessarily know any better because the force feeding of calories, like, it's not necessarily the right way to go about it. Like, you need to be in a surplus, but it needs to be small enough. Like, your body's only going to put on so much muscle so fast, regardless of how much you feed it. And so trying to just push the scale weight up as much as possible, as fast as possible, you probably will get stronger, but you're also going to get to a point where you're not going to be happy with the way that you look. You're not going to be happy with the way that you feel if you're older. and you're more concerned about your health markers, your blood work and that kind of stuff, it may not be great. And you're going to wind up peeling that weight off anyways. And so, and when you do that, unfortunately, when you do a prolonged diet, your strength numbers are going to take a hit. If your nutrition is good and your training is good, you can mitigate it to a degree, but most of the time a prolonged cut leads to some loss in strength. And it's just unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. So I'm not a huge advocate of guys just running up the scale weight as fast as humanly possible and then having to undo it later.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially when they're older.
Yeah, right. That's what I was about to
older.
say. When you're 40 plus, losing that cut is not a man. That's a tough process. When you're 25, you can do it better.
And when you go on a prolonged cut too, like that's another thing where that becomes a part of your lifestyle. That becomes, especially if you're married, you have kids, and you like that's a very say narcissistic. It's not narcissistic, but it's a very self-involved process. I mean, like a prolonged diet, you become very obsessed with the diet, and everything kind of starts to revolve around that, especially the deeper you go into it. And that lifestyle, like where you just lock yourself away in your apartment and don't eat anything and don't socialize and all that kind of stuff, that gets harder to do with time. Like that's actually easier to do when you're 25 and single or whatever. But when you're like got a family and kids and job and all that kind of stuff, like it gets harder and harder to do like a prolonged cut like that. And so the more you can align things to where your cut doesn't have to be quite as drastic, and you don't have to carry it out for such a long period of time. I think you're doing yourself a favor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining this podcast. There's a lot to chew on here, and I think you've hit on a lot of topics that we've sort of outlined them in our show, and you've taken them to a deeper level. So really appreciate that.
Okay, cool. Well, I appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah.
So before we sign off here, Andy, tell us where we can find more of your material, because you got a lot of stuff out there. You've got articles, you've got books, you've got a podcast.
The hub, the best place to go is just my website, which is andybaker.com. Just go there and that will link to all of my articles, books, downloadable training programs, one-on-one coaching, whether it's in person or online. I've got group programming that people can do, where it's a little bit more affordable option than one-on-one, where it's kind of a guided thing and access to a private forum and Facebook group and all that kind of stuff. So if people want help with any of this stuff. And again, I always tell people basically everybody's welcome in that, because I like we talked about at the beginning, I'm a guy that likes to work with a diverse group of people. Like I love all this bodybuilding talk stuff, but my most prolific client's a 71-year-old powerlifter. I mean, I love working with lifters. I love working with people who just want to improve their health and their fitness, that aren't necessarily interested in, lifting a ton of weight or, overhauling their physique or whatever. They just want to get healthy and more fit. And I like working with all demographics. I like working with athletes. And so I've got a little bit of something for everybody. And so if you're interested, come on over.
Yeah, it's great. And make sure you check out the blog while you're there. You've got a lot of great articles on kind of getting more into the nuts and bolts of what we talked about today, like specific programming recommendations. And there's just a lot of great stuff there.
Cool. Appreciate you guys having me on, and I appreciate the plug.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. Looking forward
Thanks
to
for having
yours.
me, man. Yeah, we're gonna have Robert on mine maybe next week, and then we're gonna kind of flip the script a little bit, and we're gonna go all in on nutrition.
All right, let's close out. Thank you for tuning in to the Weights and Plates podcast. You can find me at Instagram on _Robert_Santana. My website, weightsandplates.com, and you can find the gym at weights_and_plates.
There you go. You know where to find me. You can find my audio production business at marmaladecream.com, or if you're interested in online coaching or in person, if you happen to be in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, you can go to you can email me at jonesbarbellclub@gmail.com.